Hi there, and welcome to our Web Weekend podcast for October 4th, 2020. And it's hard to believe, but we are on our 30th episode. And with that, we've decided to make a little change in our backdrop. And so you may have noticed that if you have been following us here for any period of time at all. And as we continue, we do offer a live service option here at our Kingston site. And that is a very different experience than what we are able to share here online. At this point, we have chosen to continue with the podcast format online rather than live stream. And for a variety of reasons, we feel like this is a better approach for our online setting. And so it's great to be able to connect with you here, as I've mentioned, and as we take some time to share from Scripture and consider what we've heard, but also to pray together and explore what God's doing in our lives. We're launching into a new series this month, and it's a series for the month of October called Questions Jesus Asked. And so as we think about it, a lot of times we have questions that we want to give to God, and sometimes God wants us to explore some of the questions that He maybe even has for us. And in this series, over the next few weeks, we're going to explore some of the questions that Jesus asked as He was here in His earthly ministry and people engaged with Him. And maybe in some ways, He's still asking some of those questions of us today. So let's jump in to our 30th episode here today. Great to have you with us. Early in our marriage, Val and I would travel together often, and there would be a number of times early on when I would be driving and she would be dozing off to sleep in the passenger seat, which was fine and it wasn't a problem, but the only time it became a bit of a challenge is when she would feel like because she was falling asleep, I might be falling asleep too. And so there'd be a high degree of anxiety and panic that would come to her as she would wake up in the passenger seat and think I was falling asleep because she had fallen asleep, and she'd turn just almost in panic and go, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And I would say to her, "No, I'm fine. I'm not the one who's dozing off. I'm okay. I'm awake. You go ahead, put your seat back and go to sleep." "Well, no, I want to help you stay awake on our trip." And we always would laugh about how that would happen and how she would kind of wake up with that panic. "Are you okay?" And it was really her that was dozing off. You know, it's interesting as we think about things that cause us panic and they cause us anxiety in our lives. There's a lot of them. And sometimes they are really just a natural response to us realizing that we're out of control and that something has happened that is beyond our ability to respond. It sometimes is sparked by some of our established fears, some of the fears that we have in our lives about maybe water or about heights, in some of our family's case about rodents, and even as we think even more grimly about sometimes our fear of death or accidents or even other kinds of injury or challenges. And so as people in our lives, some of us tend to push beyond those fears and even create extreme experiences to be able to really resist fear. But oftentimes when we find ourselves in those moments of panic, we can respond in several different ways, can't we? We can find ourselves freezing, like I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, and I'm frozen. Like that moment when we think all of a sudden there's a car coming toward us and maybe it's going to hit us. Instead of moving more quickly, sometimes we just stand there frozen. And in some cases, we respond with a scream or a retreat and we run quickly because we're terrified. Other times, we can kind of lash out with anger. And in some cases, we've even seen maybe through a variety of videos along the way that when someone gets shocked and maybe scared in kind of a fun way, that they resort to kind of hitting the person that has been scaring them. And maybe violence even becomes a part of the way that we lash out. What's it look like in your life when you're pressed to panic? Now, the account that we're going to look at today about Jesus' life and the question that He asks is found in Mark chapter 4, and I'd encourage you, if you have a Bible with you, to open them there today. Now, in Mark chapter 4, Jesus had a very human moment that was happening. He'd had a long day of teaching at the very least, and if we kind of back up into chapter 3 of the book of Mark, we see that there are other situations that were unfolding. His own family was coming and doing what they might have considered to be an intervention, thinking that Jesus had lost his mind because he was going around behaving and thinking he was the Messiah, and they needed to step in and just bring him home and rescue him. And there were a number of religious leaders that were asking very penetrating and accusative questions of Jesus on that particular time as well. And so we're not sure if all that happened in the same day, but that would be a pretty big day for anybody to kind of encounter all of those realities. And so Jesus, at the end of the day, gets into the boat with a variety of his disciples, and he dozes off and falls asleep. Now, everybody was ready for just a leisurely ride across the Sea of Galilee, because most times in the evening, that was a common time for fishing, and it was expected that most of the time in the evening, the Sea of Galilee would be fairly calm. In this case, we can see them kind of cruising along, and then suddenly, in the story that we're reading here in Mark chapter 4, we see that a storm just whips up out of nowhere. Now, this was pretty common, but maybe more so common in the afternoon, not so common in the evening. The Sea of Galilee, if you've ever seen some of the geography of the area, it is an area that's below sea level, and there's a lot of hills around it, so it's a bit of a natural wind tunnel, so to speak. And it's not uncommon for storms to whip up quickly and wind and waves to really be aggressive in the afternoons. Now, this was happening in the evening, and this wasn't just kind of one of those ordinary storms, because the people in the boat, they were experienced on the water. A number of them were fishermen. They lived near the Sea of Galilee. They knew the patterns of the Sea of Galilee, and they find themselves in a place where they are panicking because of the severity of this storm. And their panic response in the midst of that time, after they've done everything they think of that they could possibly do, was to go and shake Jesus awake and say, "Don't you care about this? Like, we're going to die here," is essentially what they're saying. It's an accusative question because they're scared. They think that things are going to go very, very badly here, and Jesus needs to pay attention. It's like, don't you care? Don't you care that something bad is happening here to us, Jesus? And Jesus asks them the question that we want to explore today in the midst of that moment. The question that as he wakes up and turns to them, he asks is, why are you so afraid? Why are you so afraid? Now, I'm sure the disciples, at the moment that they were asked that question, they were kind of thinking, well, like, Jesus, can't you see? Like, we're in the middle of a storm here, and we could die, and you don't seem to be all that concerned about it because you're asleep. And after all of us giving up everything to follow you, and here we are in the midst of this boat, this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to take us away. This isn't fair at all. Why are you asking what is making us so afraid? But Jesus is such a master teacher that even in this moment of chaos, he's asking questions that later on they would find themselves processing. Why are they so afraid? Now, teachers who are very clever understand the value of questions. And Jesus understood the value of questions. You know the value of questions. If you have to go hunting for an answer to a question and discover it on your own, you're much more likely to remember it than as if you just have somebody answer the question for you and you move on. And so sometimes when you look things up on your own, sometimes when you discover things, sometimes as you explore the answer to the question, you really have an opportunity to learn in a very unique and different way. And this is what Jesus is doing here with the disciples. In this moment of panic, he's still teaching how they can discover the answer to this question. They can circle back to it later on, and obviously they did, because Peter, as he's sharing with John Mark this story, he has already given some consideration as to why he was so afraid. So these folks had been participating with Jesus. They'd been part of the miracles, and they've been observing the impossible. They'd been catching some of the opportunities to engage in the divine. And they'd participated with Jesus in some of the best moments that they could have possibly experienced so far. And still, in the midst of this uncertainty, with all of that moment that they had seen firsthand, they panicked. Isn't that interesting? I've kind of thought about that lately as I've been thinking about us talking about this subject today. I think this question reveals some of us have a bias in life. And I think it revealed for the disciples some of the biases that they had in life. But before we're too hard on ourselves, we do need to remember that these were the disciples and they needed to learn it just like we do. So the question that Jesus asked was, why are you so afraid? And I wonder if sometimes it's because we're trusting in our own capacity instead of God's ability. Now, in the storm, the disciples size up their ability as seafaring people. And they think, well, they can handle this. And then the waves kind of get higher and higher. And wow, now this is really terrifying. And they have the statement that flashes through their head so much more quickly than we could ever say it, which was, I don't know how we're going to get through this. Like, we don't have the resources. We don't have the ability. We don't have the know-how. We don't have the money or the strength. We don't have the energy or the understanding, the contacts, the timing, all of the things that we might need to be able to deal with this. And sometimes, like the disciples, we find ourselves looking to our own resources, and we can process them just in milliseconds and find ourselves reacting, realizing we are not enough. And too often, just like the disciples, we forget who is with us. Now, there have been times as our kids were growing that they were in a stage of life where they would make the statement, I want to do it myself. And so there were a number of things that you would seek to help them with, and they would say, no, I want to do it myself. And so you'd step back and let them do it themselves. There were times when they were trying to get on a shirt and they were small and they were trying to get their arms up through the shirt and get it on over their heads. They wanted to do it themselves, and you'd say, well, can I help you with that? No, I'm going to do it myself. And then they'd find after a while they couldn't find the right hole to put their head through, and they'd be moving in a direction. And while you're watching, you're going, I can help you here. No, I want to do it myself. And finally, when they're stuck and beyond exasperated, they say, okay, please, could you help me? I need your help. Sometimes we find ourselves in our connection with God in that position, don't we? Where we come to the end of ourselves before we really realize that we've needed Him and He's been present all along. And so in a very simple way, we are reminded here in this story, and we're reminded by Jesus' question, that the one who is with us has the resources and the ability to be able to handle the situation we're walking through. And so it behooves us to understand what it means to release control that we feel like we're lacking. And when it's overpowered by faith that God is enough, we find ourselves responding with something other than fear. So as we continue to consider Jesus' question, why are you so afraid? Sometimes it's because we're trusting our own timing instead of God's timing. Now, the disciples on this adventure across the Sea of Galilee probably had it flash through their minds that, why are you still asleep, Jesus? How can you possibly still be asleep? Don't you realize that, the waves are crashing over the top of this boat. I'm surprised the water hasn't wakened you already. Ultimately, I think that there would maybe part of them that thought in their minds, like, Jesus, if you'd wakened up earlier, that this it didn't have to be quite as dangerous as it really is. Maybe it wouldn't have got as nasty if you'd have been a part of this. But now it's at panic stage. There are times when we follow Jesus that things get done maybe in the way that we would hope them to be done, in a timing that feels to us like it's on time or it's in advance. And we can agree when God works on the time that maybe we have in our minds that God is on time, but it's harder sometimes when God operates just in the nick of time. And God isn't late, but He sure does from time to time just sweep in what seems like at the last moment and deal with the situation, when really He's been present all along and preparing us for what He wants us to see. When we lived in one of the ministry settings that we were a part of, we had completed our work at the church, and then we were on our way to the next ministry setting, which hadn't been quite revealed yet. And so we found ourselves in a position for a period of time where our house was sold and we were moving toward needing to vacate the house, but we weren't at the place where we knew quite where we were landing yet. And so as we kind of thought about that whole experience, we were trying to sort through what the options were. Should we stay in the area and rent a location and store much of our stuff so that we could kind of be close to it and to what's happening in the area before we make a move to another location? Should we go and live with some family members, which would be quite a ways away from where we were at that point? And if so, do we take all of our stuff with us? Do we store it there where we are and go someplace else? How do we work this out? And so as we were gradually emptying out the house in the process of preparing it for the day of closing, what we realized is we came down to the last Saturday and the closing was the following Tuesday, and that's when we could get the help to finish up with the house, get it all cleaned up and prepped for the final inspection. And as we did that, we were realizing that morning that we were waking up not sure just what direction we were going to take. And I've shared this with some of you before, that it seems like it was at the absolute last minute. The truck was in the yard, the helpers were in the house, and they were wondering, what do we put in the truck? And we were looking at each other going, I guess and just at that moment, a friend of mine walked in and says, I have a place for you to be able to stay. It's provided for you at no charge. You pay for your utilities, and there's no rent that you need to lay out for this particular place for the period of time that you need it. We were shocked, but it was a complete last-minute moment for us. It was right on time as far as God was concerned. It was in the nick of time, because at that moment, then we could say, okay, this is what we're going to put in the truck and take to that location. And this is what we're going to take in the truck and take to the storage location. And so working through that at the absolute last minute, it really taught us a lot about how we can trust God even to show up in the nick of time, but not necessarily the time that we always look for. It's hard for us because in the midst of that, we find ourselves releasing control that things won't always be on the schedule we look for. But ultimately, as it's overpowered by the faith that God has perfect timing, we can respond in a different way to that question, why are you so afraid? It's interesting to realize that there are probably some times when we find ourselves in a place where we trust our approach instead of God's approach. Now, we've mentioned that the disciples got into the boat, and based on their nautical experience of the Sea of Galilee, they were counting on a fairly clean and easy ride across the sea. It was evening, flowing into night, recognizing that most of the storms are over for the day. They tend to happen mostly in the afternoon. And so they were expecting that this ride was going to be kind of a smooth sail across. And then they find themselves where the wind is picking up and they're wondering, okay, well, what's going on? I mean, this isn't what we expected. And then all of a sudden it gets more and more severe and they're kind of like, whoa, this isn't what I signed up for at all. And at that point, they're a lot like all of us. When things start getting a little bit crazy, they started to probably think like we do, and that is, okay, well, what needs to happen next is, and this is getting messy, but if we can only, and this is going to be a wild ride. I don't understand how it's happened this way. This is not the way I would do it at all. And then they find themselves in the panic moment of waking Jesus up. And in many ways, they're saying, how did you let things get like this? How did you allow this storm to be so messy and let this happen? It's amazing to me, and one of the images that oftentimes has been very, very helpful for me as I understand and try and appreciate trusting God through some of the things that don't always make sense for me, is the picture of a really beautiful tapestry. And you may have heard this image before, that on the one side, the tapestry is beautiful and you see the pattern and you understand all of the way it fits together. But on the other side, the marks are different and some of the yarn is going in multiple directions, and it may not necessarily be the most beautiful image that you would have imagined in order to make up that picture that you know on the side that you want to display. And in life sometimes, and in faith, sometimes it's like we see the backside of the tapestry and we don't get to see the front side all the time. We don't always understand the beautiful pattern that Jesus is making in our lives and in the lives of people around us, and how he's using us and them together to accomplish his purposes, creating the beautiful picture of the tapestry. We just see the back and we're wondering, why does this go in that direction and why does this go that way? And it's kind of ugly. There's nothing beautiful about this whole picture. And sometimes we find ourselves in a place where we think it may need to happen a certain way, kind of the way we have imagined. And when it doesn't, we can find ourselves maybe even shaking our fist at God a little bit, like the disciples were, in a bit of an angry way, saying, God, you're not doing it the way that it ought to be done. And, we see how we need to trust God, but it kind of blows away all of our sensibilities as we discover that our expectations are exceeded by his creativity and solutions. And so sometimes we need to find ourselves in a place where we release control, that it's not being done the way we prefer, and let it be overpowered by faith in God that he will make it right. Now, in my life, I've had a number of situations where I've had people who have been coaches, and some of them have been sports coaches, some of them have been coaches as it relates to processing through things related to ministry or a variety of other kinds of situations along the way. And coaching experiences can be very, very positive and very encouraging. And so they tend to come to the table and seek to ask good questions. They come to the table to help us to see things from a completely different perspective. And in one situation where I was coming up against a very difficult challenge, the coach that I had at the time started asking some very interesting questions. And I had been approaching it in a particular way, and then all of a sudden, some of their questions helped reveal a brand new way to look at the situation. It actually freed up a log jam that was kind of a frustrating thing that was opening up opportunities for us now as a congregation, because the coach helped me to see things from a completely different perspective, that there were other options available to be able to understand. I think that might be some of what Jesus is doing here with this question. When he asks, "Why are you so afraid?" it's because he knows that our default is to look at ourselves instead of him. And sometimes we can find ourselves in a place where the God we worship is actually just an enlarged or bigger version of ourselves. A God who thinks like us, a God who sees like us, a God who approaches things like us, and considers the way that we see things and the way we approach things. We don't realize how limited we make God until we find ourselves in a position where we're at the edge. And ultimately, in that moment of uncertainty, those moments that are in our lives that look a lot like the ones the disciples experienced, Jesus asks and seeks for us to explore this question in moments like that. Why are you so afraid? Because it's in those moments where our natural tendency is to panic that he's looking to create a different option for us. And we've all had those moments where we've been feeling like we needed to panic, where our abilities are threatened, and it sometimes is sparked from our established fears. And the response that comes from being out of control is sometimes in our faith, we freeze. We might scream or retreat or run. We might lash out in anger. And ultimately, Jesus continues to ask the question, why are you so afraid? And it's because that he realizes that we may have forgotten who is with us. And that creates a completely different set of options that are available for us as we engage with him. And for those of us who follow Jesus, the total new approach to the way that these issues unfold in our lives, especially as we see them as exceeding our capacity, can be processed because of the presence of Jesus. Ultimately, the presence of Jesus brings the peace of God. And Paul talks about this in the New Testament where he says, "Let the peace of God rule in your hearts." Now that word "rule in your hearts" is to let it have authority, let it have priority, and to let it have our loyalty. Now, as we consider what that would mean, and as we consider what it means to be afraid in the midst of some of our situations, God is giving us the completely different option to respond with faith instead of fear. So the question that we find ourselves asking from what Jesus has sparked for us today, why are you so afraid, is what difference can the presence and life of Jesus make in what threatens us today? So that's the kind of a question that we want to ask as we're really seeking to discover how God wants to put this into practice in our lives. As we think about the question, why are we so afraid? And as we explore some of the process of saying, what difference can the presence and life of Jesus make in what threatens me today? It can be an exciting reality to recognize that we can respond to life with the peace and the assurance of God in our lives, as opposed to the fear and the panic that may have been so present in us. As we follow Jesus, he longs to help us see from that very different perspective. And as you explore the questions that you'll find in the podcast extras, what does this help me to see about God? What does this help me to see about myself? And how do I put into practice what I've heard and understood? As you consider some of what God is doing in your life today, my prayer for you is that God will continue to allow his presence to reveal his peace in the midst of uncertainty, in the midst of moments that would naturally make us panic. As Jesus asks us that question, why are we so afraid? Let me pray for us today. Jesus, we come to you and we acknowledge our need of you. God, there are a lot of times when we look to ourselves and our own capacity, we look to our own abilities, we look to our own timing, we sometimes even look to our own approach, and we limit you to those things as opposed to giving you license to operate in the way that you will. And so today, we thank you for the fact that you are in control. We trust you today. And as we follow you, we acknowledge that sometimes we trip up and we find ourselves responding more out of fear than we do out of faith. And so God, help us to understand how the life and presence of Jesus can transform the way that we respond to life today and the situations that are before us. We love you and we thank you for your goodness to us today, Jesus. You are good to us beyond what we deserve. And we thank you for the way that you teach us and lead us. In your name I pray. Amen. I've mentioned the podcast extras, and as you explore those, that you find in the description section of YouTube, and as well there is a link to them in the description section of the version of this video on Facebook. We would encourage you to be able to participate with some of the worship songs that are there. They will link you to YouTube and give you an opportunity as lyric videos to be able to engage with those throughout this week. There are links there to our kids ministry and great opportunities for your family to be able to engage in some teaching opportunities, some fun times to be able to share around the screen together. And let me encourage you to jump on and explore that as well. Also links to communication here with us as a church and to giving, and so all of those are found in the podcast extras. I want to thank you for sharing these few minutes with me here today and giving me the opportunity to visit with you. I would encourage you, as I often do, to like, comment, or share this video. And if you have anything specific that you'd like to share with us that is of personal nature, then the email that's on the screen is the path to be able to do that. Farewell. And as always, we are praying for you, and we trust that you're praying for us too, as we seek to minister His goodness and blessing in the places where we live, where we work, and where we play, and where we learn during this week. And we'll see you soon.